She'd been writing him anonymous letters for a year. Then one day, her blind date turned out to be him. Wyatt Sutter had turned the same cardboard coaster over in his hand about 11 times by the time he admitted to himself he wasn't actually reading the tap list taped above the bar. He was just giving his hands something to do that wasn't checking his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. Millhouse Brewing was doing its usual Thursday crowd, long communal tables full of people who all seemed to already know each other. And Wyatt had claimed the small corner two-top like it might shield him from the fact that he was about to sit across from a stranger his sister had picked out for him like produce at a farmer's market. He was 31, a CNC machinist at Bell Precision Machining, the kind of job that measured success in thousandths of an inch and didn't leave a lot of room for error or excuses. And he'd been back stateside 14 months now after an 11-month deployment to Kuwait, with his guard unit that had drained his savings account faster than it drained anything else. Guard pay running well under his civilian wage the whole time he was gone. He was mostly caught up on the difference by now. Not rich, never going to be rich running a mill for a living, but caught up enough that he'd stop doing math in his head every time he filled his truck with gas. The shop itself sat in an industrial park out past the county line. 3 bay doors and a floor that smelled permanently of cutting oil and hot metal shavings. And Wyatt had worked his way up from running a manual lathe as a teenager under Hollis's supervision to programming 5-axis mills that could hold a tolerance most people would need a microscope to appreciate. In the console of that truck, tucked under a rag next to a set of dial calipers that used to belong to his grandfather Hollis, sat a folded piece of notebook paper Wyatt had read enough times that he could probably recite it without looking, though he never would have admitted that to anybody, least of all a blind date. He'd never once studied the handwriting itself, never had a reason to. The words were the part that mattered to him, not the shape of the letters carrying them. His sister Georgia had been after him for months to actually try this, ever since she got to talking with a woman from her volleyball league named Fiona, who apparently had a co-worker Georgia thought sounded perfect for him, and Wyatt had turned her down 4 separate times before finally running out of excuses that didn't sound like what they actually were, which was a guy who hadn't figured out how to want anything again since he got home. Her name's Piper, Georgia had said, like that settled anything. And if you cancel on me one more time, I'm telling Grandma Hollis's old dog stories to every woman in this town myself. Wyatt didn't have a comeback for that one. Mostly because Georgia absolutely would. The door chimed and a woman walked in, scanning the room with the particular urgency of somebody running a few minutes behind and hating it, dark hair pulled back in a way that looked more practical than styled, wiping one hand discreetly on her jeans before she spotted him and started over. Sorry, she said, sliding into the chair across from him before she'd even fully sat down. I had a press jam right as I was clocking out, and now I've got ink under 2 fingernails. I'm never getting back before this date's over. I wasn't going to say anything, Wyatt said, but now that you mention it, yeah, I see it. Great start, she said, laughing despite herself, and stuck out the offending hand anyway. Piper Hale. Wyatt Sutter, he said, shaking it, and something in the back of her mind registered the first half of that name, the way you register a stranger's face that resembles somebody you used to know, quick and faint and gone almost as soon as it landed. Because Wyatt wasn't exactly a rare name, and she'd written to more service members over the years than she could rattle off from memory anyway. 3 years volunteering with Homefront Letters had trained that reflex out of her a long time ago. Besides, since the program kept things to first names only on both ends. No surnames, no photos, nothing that would let a volunteer and a service member track each other down unless they both chose to. A first name matching up meant nothing on its own. She filed it away without a second thought and reached for the menu instead. Press jam, Wyatt said. That's a print shop thing? Ridgeline Print and Sign, Piper said. Large format, vinyl, banners, the occasional 4-color job that makes me question my career choices. Today's jam was a rush order for a client who wanted registration tight enough to make a surgeon nervous, and the machine decided today was the day to disagree with me about it. Registration, Wyatt repeated. That's the alignment thing, right? Making sure all the colors stack up exact. Exact within a fraction of a millimeter, or the client calls and yells at somebody. Piper said. What's your version of that? Georgia said machinist, but I don't actually know what that means. Beyond you probably own more tools than furniture. Not far off, Wyatt said. I run mills and lathes, mostly agricultural equipment parts, and the tolerance on some of what I cut is plus or minus a couple thousandths of an inch, which is about a 20th the width of a human hair, if you want to feel bad about your own hand-eye coordination. Piper set her menu down. So we're both just spending our whole day making sure things line up to a fraction nobody else in the room could actually see. Guess so, Wyatt said. And something in the coincidence of it, small and unimportant as it was, eased something in his shoulders that had been tight since he walked in. Never thought about it that way, but yeah. They ordered a flight for her, a single pale ale for him because he was driving, and the conversation kept finding its own footing without either of them forcing it. Piper telling him about the client who'd once demanded a banner reprinted 3 times over a shade of blue, only she could apparently see the difference in. Wyatt telling her about the time he'd scrapped an entire batch of parts because a coolant line had drifted .002 off spec, and nobody caught it until final inspection. Neither story was particularly funny on its own, but something about the way they told them made the other laugh anyway. The specific, unglamorous comedy of 2 people whose jobs demanded a precision most people never noticed or cared about. There was a stretch, maybe 4 or 5 minutes long, somewhere around the second round, where neither of them said much of anything at all. Just sat there watching the brewery's flight night crowd get progressively louder at the long tables. And it wasn't the awkward kind of silence Wyatt had braced himself for walking in. It was the kind that didn't need filling, the kind where 2 people are comfortable enough not to perform being interesting at each other for a minute. Piper noticed it too, the particular ease of not needing to talk, and filed that away with a little more attention she'd given his name. Can I ask you something, and you tell me if it's too much for a first date? Piper said eventually, turning her glass slowly on the table. Depends what it is, Wyatt said, but go ahead. Georgia mentioned you were overseas a while back. Kuwait, I think she said. Piper watched him for a reaction before continuing. You don't have to talk about it if that's not a first date kind of conversation. Wyatt considered that for a second, surprised at how little he minded the question coming from her. 11 months, logistics unit, mostly boring if I'm honest. A lot of waiting around and paperwork punctuated by not enough sleep. He turned his own glass a quarter turn, an old habit he didn't notice himself doing. Actually, since you asked, Wyatt said, and something in his voice shifted, dropped a register. There's this volunteer program where people back home write general encouragement letters that get sent to the unit. Not to anybody specific, just whoever needs one that day. They come through mail call in big batches. You grab one if you want. Most guys don't bother. I didn't either, until my grandfather passed while I was in country. Guy named Hollis raised me, taught me half of what I know about running a lathe before I ever set foot in a shop that paid me for it. Emergency leave got approved, but the flights didn't line up right, missed the funeral by 4 days, and I was about as low as I've ever been in my life that week. I've heard of programs like that, Piper said carefully, something in her chest going very still, in a way she couldn't have explained to anybody watching. Grabbed one of those letters out of mail call that week. Random, just needed something that wasn't a briefing or bad news, Wyatt said. Signed Wren at the bottom, no last name, no return address, just a few lines about how grief doesn't run on anybody else's schedule, and you don't have to be okay right now to still be worth showing up for tomorrow. Don't know who she was, never met her, couldn't write back even if I wanted to, because there's no address on those things. But I kept it. Glove box of my truck, if you want to know exactly how big of a sentimental mess I secretly am. Piper's hand had gone flat and motionless against the condensation on her glass, and she was very deliberately not looking anywhere but his face, because looking away felt like it would give something away. She wasn't ready to hand over yet. What did it say? Piper asked, and her voice came out quieter than she meant it to, careful in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Wyatt looked at her for a second, like he was deciding how much of himself to hand a stranger on a first date, then decided it didn't matter anymore. Not after the day he'd already had getting here. Something like, you don't have to be okay today, You just have to be here tomorrow to try again. Sounds simple written out like that? Didn't feel simple at the time. Piper sat very still, turning that sentence over in her mind, the phrasing landing somewhere familiar, the kind of thing that sounded like something she'd write but didn't belong to her exclusively enough to claim it on a first date. That's a lot to carry around in a glove box, she said instead, which was true and also the safest thing to say when you weren't sure yet, whether a coincidence was real or just your brain looking for patterns that weren't there. Yeah, Wyatt said, coming back to himself, glancing at her like he'd surprised even himself by saying all that to somebody he'd known for 90 minutes. Didn't mean to make a whole thing out of it. You asked about Kuwait. You got the extended director's cut, my bad. Don't apologize, Piper said, and meant it more than he could possibly have known. I asked. I wanted the real answer, not the polite one. Wyatt studied her for a second. Something in her expression he couldn't quite place, and then let it go, chalking it up to the general weirdness of telling a stranger something that heavy on a first date. Well, he said, signaling for the check, for what it's worth, this has been a considerably better night than the one where I told Georgia I'd rather clean out gutters than go on another blind date. High praise, Piper said, managing something close to a real laugh, even with her pulse still doing something strange under her ribs, and she gathered her jacket off the back of her chair, thinking the entire drive home about a folded piece of paper sitting in a truck's glove box 2 miles from her apartment. Written in handwriting, she was fairly sure she'd recognize the second she laid eyes on it again. She said goodnight in the parking lot, a normal, ordinary goodbye that gave away nothing of what was sitting behind it, and sat in her car for a full minute after Wyatt's taillights disappeared, before she trusted herself enough to turn the key. Piper Hale had her whole arm shoved up inside a vinyl cutter's carriage assembly, hunting down a jammed roller by feel because the service light had been blinking amber for 20 minutes, and the rush job wasn't going to print itself, when Wyatt's voice came from the doorway of Ridgeline's back room, asking if she wanted a second set of hands or if this was a one-woman operation kind of problem. 5 weeks into whatever this had become, Wyatt showing up mid-shift with 2 coffees had stopped being a surprise and started being a Tuesday. And neither of them had bothered naming what they were doing. They just kept doing it. What started as a blind date, built on borrowed comfort, turned into the week a folded piece of paper in a truck's glove box, finally found its way into the right hands. And neither of them walked away from that night the same person who'd walked in. The 5 weeks in between had built themselves out of small, practical exchanges neither of them made a production out of. Piper started dropping by the machine shop on her lunch break some Fridays, sitting on an overturned bucket, eating a sandwich while Wyatt set up a job. And once, when a coolant hose blew loose and sprayed across the floor, she grabbed a shop rag and helped mop it up without being asked. Wyatt never treated the shop like something that needed explaining, and Piper found herself looking forward to those Fridays, sitting in a building that smelled like cutting oil, listening to a machinist talk through a setup sheet. Wyatt paid it back showing up at Ridgeline with a torque driver he'd noticed she needed, fixing a strip screw in under 10 minutes while she held the panel steady. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm neither of them had bothered defining out loud. Coffee some mornings before her shift, a beer after his some evenings, a running joke about whose job actually required more patience that neither of them would concede. And if either of them had stopped to name what they were building, they might have called it the first thing in a long while that hadn't felt like it needed managing. It was on one of those ordinary Tuesdays, both of them sitting on overturned buckets in the back room while a fresh job ran through the cutter, that Piper said something offhand about her grandmother, the woman who'd raised her most of her childhood while her parents worked double shifts, and how her grandmother used to leave notes tucked into her school lunches, even when Piper was old enough to drive herself to school. Little scraps of encouragement that never felt corny coming from her, just steady and real. Wyatt listened, something warm crossing his face, and said, without thinking twice about it, "That's exactly the kind of thing Wren would have written." Piper's hands went still on her coffee cup. It wasn't a cruel thing to say, wasn't even a strange thing to say, just an easy, warm comparison from a man who genuinely meant it as a compliment. And that was somehow worse than if he'd meant it any other way, because it meant he'd already built a version of the person he thought Wren was, and he was measuring the actual woman sitting across from him against it without even realizing he was doing it. Yeah, Piper said, working to keep her voice light. Sounds like she had good instincts. She did, Wyatt said, oblivious to what he'd just handed her, already moving on to something about the cutter's alignment settings. And Piper spent the rest of that afternoon doing her job on autopilot, turning the sentence over and over, wondering how many more offhand comparisons, like that one, were sitting ahead of her if she kept saying nothing. 3 nights after the moment with her grandmother's notes, 5.5 weeks in now since that first night at Millhouse, Wyatt invited her over to his apartment for the first time. Nothing formal about it, just takeout containers on his coffee table and a baseball game playing low in the background that neither of them was actually watching. At some point, reaching for the remote, Wyatt's hand brushed the strap of a small canvas bag he kept by the couch, the same bag he used to carry tools between the shop and his truck, and something made him pull it into his lap instead, unzipping the side pocket and pulling out the folded piece of notebook paper Piper had been thinking about for 5 straight weeks. Been meaning to show you this since the brewery, Wyatt said, holding it out, a little sheepish about it now that the moment had actually arrived. Figured showing you beats just talking about it. Piper took it with hands that weren't quite as steady as she wanted them to be, unfolding the paper carefully along creases worn soft from a year of being refolded, and she didn't even need to read the first full sentence. The shape of her own handwriting hit her before the words did. The particular slant she'd had since high school, the way she always crossed her T's a little too far to the right. She read 3 lines. She read them again. The room had gone very quiet except for the low murmur of the game on television. The specific phrase Wyatt had quoted from memory back at the brewery was right there in the second paragraph, word for word, exactly the way she'd written it. Sitting at her kitchen table one night during a stretch where she'd been writing a dozen letters a week to nobody in particular, just trying to say something that might land for somebody somewhere going through the kind of loss that didn't have a clean answer. Piper? Wyatt said, watching her face change. You okay? She set the letter down on the coffee table, like it might shatter, and looked up at him. And for a second, she genuinely didn't know how to start the sentence that had been sitting in her chest for 5 weeks. I wrote this, she said finally, plain and quiet. No easy way to soften it. Wyatt, I'm Wren. Wyatt didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked at the letter, then at her, then back at the letter, like he was trying to make his eyes agree with what his ears had just told him. He started and stopped and tried again. You wrote this, the one letter I kept. Out of all the mail call I ignored for 11 months, the one I grabbed was yours. He looked down at the single page between them, the only piece of encouragement from a stranger he'd ever carried around, like it mattered. Homefront letters, Piper said. I've volunteered with them 3 years. Wren's my grandmother's nickname for me. I sign every letter with it. We're not supposed to use real names. It's protocol. Letters go out to units and batches. Nobody's matched to anybody. It's all random. She was talking fast now, the words tumbling out ahead of her nerve. That night at the brewery, when you quoted that line about not having to be okay today, it sounded like something I'd written. But I write dozens of those letters, Wyatt. I couldn't be sure until I actually saw the handwriting just now. And even if I'd been sure that first night, you were in the middle of telling me about losing Hollis, and interrupting that to make it about me felt wrong. So I waited. And then it got harder every week I didn't say anything. Wyatt sat back against the couch cushions, running one hand slowly over his jaw, and Piper watched him work through it in real time, instead of rushing to fill his silence, the way she'd been doing in her own head for 5 weeks straight. I don't, he started, then shook his head like he was trying to physically reset the thought. I don't know what to do with this yet. That's the honest answer. Not upset, not thrilled, just I've got this whole version of somebody in my head who got me through the worst week of my life while I was thousands of miles from home, and now she's sitting on my couch, and I don't actually know how those two things are supposed to be the same person yet. That's fair, Piper said, and meant it, even though it landed somewhere tender in her chest. It's not that I don't believe you, Wyatt said, quick to clarify, nodding at the paper still sitting between them. Handwriting's right there. I'm not questioning that part. It's just give me a second to actually catch up to what this means. Because 5 minutes ago I was watching a baseball game with a woman I've been seeing for 5 weeks. And now I'm finding out she's also the reason I made it through the worst month of my adult life. And my brain hasn't figured out yet whether that's the same fact told twice or two different facts I need to hold at the same time. Piper nodded slowly, watching him work through it with the same careful, methodical attention he probably brought to a machine that wasn't holding tolerance. And something in her chest, already raw from 5 weeks of carrying this alone, cracked open a little further. "Can I tell you what I'm actually scared of?" she said, "since we're already doing the honest version of tonight?" "Yeah," Wyatt said. "Go ahead." "I'm scared you're going to spend the next however long comparing the real me to the version of me that only ever showed up in letters I had time to think through before I sent them," Piper said, her voice steadier now that the worst of it was already out in the open. Wren always said the right thing, because Wren got to draft it twice and cross out the parts that sounded whiny. I don't get a rewrite when I'm tired and short with people, or when I've had a bad day at the shop, and I'm not particularly charming about it. You said it yourself 20 minutes before any of this came out. That thing about your grandmother's notes? That's exactly the kind of thing Wren would have written. You didn't mean anything cruel by it, but you already had her built in your head as some kind of standard, and now I've got to live next to that standard every single day, and I don't know if I can. Wyatt didn't have a fast answer for that, and to his credit, he didn't try to manufacture one just to fill the silence. "I hear you," he said instead, quiet, honest. "I don't have a clean fix for that tonight. I probably need some time to actually sit with all of this instead of just saying the thing that sounds good in the moment." "I think I need that too," Piper said, gathering her jacket off the arm of the couch. Careful and unhurried about it, no dramatics in the leaving. Not forever. Just some space to let this settle before either of us decides what it means. "Okay," Wyatt said, standing with her, not reaching for her, not trying to talk her out the door slower than she wanted to go. "I'm not going anywhere, Piper. I just need to actually think, same as you." She nodded, picked the letter up off the coffee table and set it gently back in his hands instead of taking it with her. A small, deliberate choice that told him more than anything else she could have said that night. "It's still yours," she said. "It always was. I just never imagined the guy I wrote it to would end up sitting across from me at a brewery a year later, and that I'd be too much of a coward to say so for 5 weeks straight." Wyatt walked her to the door, and neither of them tried to turn the goodbye into something bigger than it honestly was, both of them standing there a beat too long before she finally stepped out into the hallway. And it wasn't until Piper was 3 streets away, driving home with the radio off and both hands steady on the wheel now that the worst of the conversation was behind her, that she let herself actually cry, not out of regret, just out of the particular exhaustion of finally putting down something she'd been carrying alone for 5 straight weeks. Piper Hale had exactly 14 minutes to save a $400 banner order before Ridgeline's doors locked for the night. Standing over a vinyl cutter that had just chewed through the last full roll of matte white stock, because somebody, probably her, had forgotten to reset the blade depth after the morning's job. And it was in the middle of that particular disaster that Wyatt Sutter walked through the back door exactly on schedule for a Thursday night that had nothing to do with letters or reveals or any of it. Just a plan they'd made 3 days earlier to grab dinner after her shift. What started as 2 weeks of careful, respectful distance turned into the night Wyatt found out, without either of them planning it, whether he actually wanted the real Piper or just the idea he'd been carrying around in a glove box for a year. The 2 weeks since his apartment had gone exactly the way both of them said they needed. No dramatics. No radio silence either. Just space handled like adults handle things when they actually respect each other. Wyatt hadn't shown up at Ridgeline uninvited once. Hadn't flooded her phone with texts trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed with words alone. Just let her know through Georgia, who was still close with Fiona from the volleyball league, that he was around whenever she was ready. No pressure attached to the offer. Piper had used the time the way she needed to, running the fear over in her head enough times that she'd started to recognize the difference between a fear that was actually about Wyatt and a fear that was really about every other time in her life she'd worried she wasn't enough of something for somebody. By the end of the second week, when Wyatt texted asking if Thursday still worked for dinner, The same plan they'd been sitting on since before any of the letter business ever came up. Piper had said yes without needing to think about it first. She'd also done something else with those 2 weeks that she hadn't mentioned to Wyatt yet, pulling up her own volunteer records with Homefront letters and counting back through exactly how many letters she'd written during his 11-month deployment window, 41 in total sent to his unit's mail rotation. Most of them the kind of ordinary encouragement she wrote to everyone. Only a handful anything close to personal. And somewhere in that accounting, she'd realized how thin the actual idea of Wren really was compared to 5 weeks of real conversations, real bad days, real grease under real fingernails standing next to him at a machine shop bench. The cutter's blade depth indicator sat at a reading that made no sense once Piper finally looked at it properly. Set 2 millimeters deeper than the job called for, slicing clean through the backing material on every pass instead of just scoring the vinyl the way it was supposed to. And by the time she caught the error, the whole roll was ribboned into unusable strips. 40 feet of expensive stock gone in under a minute of running blind. The client, a new bakery opening its doors at 7 the next morning, was expecting a finished storefront banner delivered by 6. And Ridgeline didn't keep a second roll of that particular matte white in stock, which meant Piper was standing in the back room, doing math on whether any supplier within driving distance would still be open, phone in one hand, ruined vinyl pooling around her boots. "Rough night," Wyatt said from the doorway, taking in the scene, the shredded roll, Piper's expression somewhere between furious and about to cry from sheer exhaustion. Ink smudged up one forearm from an earlier job she hadn't had time to wash off. "Blade depth got reset and I didn't catch it until it ate through 40 feet of stock I don't have a backup for," Piper said, not bothering to soften it, too tired for anything but the flat truth. "Bakery's opening at 7 tomorrow, expecting a finished banner, and I've got exactly 0 options left on the shelf here." Wyatt didn't offer sympathy first, didn't ask if she was okay, just crossed the room and crouched down next to the cutter, checking the depth, setting himself with the same unhurried, methodical attention. He gave a machine at his own shop that wasn't holding tolerance. "Depth gauge is the same brand as 2 machines at Bell," he said more to himself than to her. "You got a supplier who does after-hours pickup, or is everybody in this industry locked up tight by 6? There's a Signcraft franchise 40 minutes out that's open till 10, Piper said, already pulling up the number on her phone. "They stock vinyl, but it's retail pricing. Way over wholesale." "Better than no banner," Wyatt said, already grabbing his truck keys back out of his pocket. "You call, I'll drive, we'll get you back here with enough time to make deadline if the roads stay clear." They made the 40-minute drive in 28, Wyatt taking the state highway instead of the interstate, because he knew the timing on the lights better, Piper on the phone the whole way, confirming they had the right stock. And when they pulled into the parking lot at 9:10, Wyatt walked in and paid for the roll in cash before Piper could get her card out, waving off her protest with a flat, "Square it up later. We don't have time to argue right now." He loaded the roll into the truck bed himself, strapped it down tight enough that it wouldn't shift on the drive back, and didn't say a single word about how late it was getting or how this wasn't exactly the dinner plan they'd made 3 days earlier. Back at Ridgeline, Wyatt held the new roll steady on the feed spindle, while Piper reset the blade depth by hand, testing it twice on scrap material before trusting it with the actual job, and they ran the banner together, him watching the material feed evenly while she monitored the print heads, both of them quiet and focused the same way they'd been quiet and focused over a stuck vise and a jammed cutter weeks earlier, before any of this had a name attached to it. The banner came off the machine a little after 11, clean, correctly registered, ready for delivery in the morning, and Piper stood there staring at it for a second, like she genuinely couldn't believe it had actually worked out. "You drove 40 minutes each way on what was supposed to be a normal dinner," Piper said, wiping down the cutter's rollers out of habit more than necessity at this point. "Wasn't going to sit in a booth somewhere, pretending I didn't know you were back here drowning," Wyatt said, like the alternative had never actually occurred to him as an option. "This is exactly what I was scared of, you know," Piper said, setting the rag down, deciding the night had already been honest enough that there wasn't much point stopping now. "Not the drive. The fact that you just did all that without it being some big gesture. Wren never had ink under her nails at 11 at night, stressing about a bakery's grand opening. Wren just wrote the right sentence and mailed it off. This, she gestured at herself, at the mess of the night. This is the actual me, and I needed to know if that version was still somebody you wanted around. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, tired the same way she was tired, grease on his own hands now from helping haul vinyl. Nothing romantic or polished about either one of them standing in a print shop's back room at 11 at night. Piper, I've spent 2 weeks trying to separate two people in my head who turned out to just be one person the whole time, he said. And somewhere in that 40-minute drive tonight, arguing with you about whether the interstate or the highway was faster, I stopped thinking about Wren entirely. Didn't even occur to me until you just brought her up again. I wasn't out here proving anything to myself tonight. I was just trying to help you make a deadline because that's what you do for somebody you're falling for, letters or no letters. Piper felt something in her chest finally loosen after 2 weeks of holding it tight. Say that part again, she said. The falling for part. I'm falling for you, Wyatt said, plain, no dramatics, exactly the kind of sentence a man says when he's too tired at 11 at night to dress it up as anything other than what it actually is. Not the letters, you. The version standing here with ink on her arm yelling at a vinyl cutter. They finished cleaning up together, and when Piper finally locked the shop's back door, a little after midnight, Wyatt walked her to her car the same unhurried way he had after that very first date, except this time neither of them pretended the night hadn't meant anything. Georgia found out the whole story 2 days later, sitting across from Piper at Fiona's kitchen table over coffee, and by the time Piper finished explaining the pen name and the letter and Hollis's funeral, Georgia had set her mug down so hard coffee sloshed over the rim. You're telling me I set my own brother up with the woman who wrote him through losing Grandpa Hollis, and neither of us had any idea, Georgia said, staring between Piper and Fiona, like she was checking whether this was some elaborate joke. Fiona looked just as stunned, shaking her head slowly. I picked you because you two both work with your hands and neither of you ever shuts up about tolerances, Fiona said. I had no idea there was a whole other story sitting underneath that. Nobody did, Piper said. That's kind of the whole point of a pen name. Georgia laughed, a little disbelieving, wiping up the spilled coffee with a napkin. Grandpa Hollis would have loved this. He always said the universe had a weird sense of timing. She looked at Piper with something warmer than surprise now. I'm glad it was you, genuinely. Fiona, still turning the coincidence over in her head, looked at Piper with something between amazement and mild professional pride. So all those Sunday afternoons you spent at my kitchen table writing letters, complaining about not knowing if anybody even read them, she said slowly. One of them was sitting 40 miles from here, memorizing every word. Piper laughed, something easy and unguarded in it, for the first time since the whole thing started. Guess I should have kept better track of my own rotation, she said. Would have saved us all a very confusing dinner conversation. 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Wednesday morning, Wyatt reached into his truck for the canvas bag he carried his lunch in and found a folded piece of paper tucked between his sandwich and a thermos of coffee. Notebook paper again, same careful handwriting he'd know anywhere by now, except this time when he unfolded it. The signature at the bottom read, Piper, not Wren, plain and real and unhidden. The letter wasn't long, just a few lines about how she'd watched him load a roll of vinyl into his truck bed at 9 o'clock at night without complaining once, and how she figured a man like that deserved to hear it from the actual person instead of a pen name he'd never met. That evening, Wyatt drove home and pulled both letters out, the old one soft and worn from a year of being carried around a deployment in a truck's glove box, and the new one still crisp from that morning, and pinned them both side by side on the corkboard hanging over his workbench, right next to a torque spec sheet and a photo of Hollis standing in front of the very lathe Wyatt still ran every day. The bare shop bulb overhead caught both pages at the same angle, one written by a stranger trying to reach a man she'd never meet, the other written by a woman who already knew exactly who she was writing to, and Wyatt stood there a minute just looking at them, side by side, before he flipped off the light and went to make dinner.